The tension in the conference chamber could have been cut with a blade, as the assembled representatives processed what Ambassador Hugh had told them about human nature and warfare and psychology, and several species were already transmitting emergency reports back to their homeworlds because the implications of a species that weaponized spite and persistence were becoming terrifyingly clear, and Trade Minister Voxlar's crystalline structure was flickering through colors that indicated extreme agitation, while Security Chief Rentok had his four hands resting on weapons that suddenly seemed inadequate against an enemy that did not fight in ways that weapons could counter. "I believe," said Hyuk into the heavy silence, "that it is time for a practical demonstration of what I have been describing." And he looked up toward the command booth where Commander Thalvex stood watching. "And I apologize in advance, Commander, because what I'm about to show you will be uncomfortable but necessary." Thalvex felt his scales ripple in alarm, and he was reaching for his communication controls when suddenly every screen in the conference chamber changed to display a new image that made his blood run cold because it showed the station's internal security network with all access codes and override protocols clearly visible, and beside him, Kivri made a sound of distress as her mandibles clattered in panic. "For the past 3 days," continued Hyuk as though he was discussing something as mundane as the weather, "human operatives have had complete access to every system on this station, including life support, and weapons, and navigation, and communication," and he smiled slightly. "And before you ask how this is possible, let me introduce you to Captain Jiwoo, who has been waiting very patiently in Docking Bay 7. The holographic display changed again to show the interior of a docking bay where a vessel that everyone had assumed was debris, or a disabled civilian craft suddenly activated with lights and systems coming online, and a human woman appeared on screen, standing in what was clearly a military command center that had been hidden in plain sight for 3 full days. "This is Captain Jiwoo of the human stealth vessel Quiet Knife," said the woman with a professional military bearing that was completely different from Hyuk's diplomatic manner, "and I am pleased to report that our infiltration of station systems has been completed successfully with zero detection by security protocols." The chamber erupted in chaos as representatives began shouting and demanding explanations, while security officers drew weapons that they had no targets to point at, and Commander Thalvex was frantically trying to regain control of his own systems, only to discover that his command codes no longer worked, and his access had been locked out by someone who understood the station's security architecture better than the beings who had designed it. "Please remain calm," said Hyuk, raising his voice just enough to cut through the noise, "because no harm has been done to anyone, and no systems have been damaged." And gradually, the chaos subsided into an angry muttering, "And I want to be very clear that this demonstration was not an attack, but rather an illustration of the gap between what your sensors can detect and what humans can actually do." Security Chief Rentok was pushing his way toward the speaking platform with clear intent to either arrest or harm the human ambassador. But before he could reach Hyuk, another screen activated showing a human woman with short dark hair and technical equipment surrounding her. "I am Engineer Bora," said the woman, "and I want to explain how we accomplished what your security chief is probably trying very hard not to think about." And she pulled up schematics of the station's computer networks, because the answer is both simple and deeply concerning for your civilization. Bora proceeded to describe in technical detail how the human team had exploited not software vulnerabilities, but rather behavioral patterns and how the various species operated their technology. And she explained that humans had spent weeks studying galactic psychology and identifying assumptions that every species made about security, and then designing approaches that specifically targeted those assumptions, like the fact that most species assumed primitive technology could not interface with advanced systems, or that multiple independent scans would catch anything the first scan missed, or that beings would notice changes in their own networks. "The fundamental problem," said Bora, "is that your entire security paradigm is based on detecting known threats using catalog signatures," and she highlighted sections of code on her display, "but humans specialize in becoming unknown threats that do not match any existing signatures," and she smiled in a way that did not suggest friendliness. "And by the time you update your databases to detect us, we will have already evolved new approaches." Ambassador Hayek waited for the technical explanation to sink in before continuing with his own presentation, and he could see the growing understanding and fear in the eyes of beings who had spent their lives feeling secure in their technological superiority. 3 months ago, said Hayek, human vessels began operating in this sector using stealth technology that is primitive by your standards, but effective because it is based on principles that galactic sensors are not programmed to look for. And he showed a map with dozens of markers indicating human ship movements, and during that time we have been conducting detailed reconnaissance of every major power's military capabilities and economic infrastructure and political relationships. The key map was damning because it showed human ships in places that should have been impossible to reach without detection, and Trade Minister Voxelar finally found his voice to ask the question that everyone was thinking. "Why are you telling us this?" demanded the crystalline being with colors that suggested he was oscillating between rage and fear. "Because if you truly had such capabilities, you would gain more advantage by keeping them secret." Yuk nodded as though the question was exactly what he had been waiting for, and his expression became very serious as he prepared to explain the real purpose of this entire demonstration. "We are telling you this," said Hayek, "because we want you to understand something crucial about humanity." And he deactivated all the threatening displays and returned to showing simple images of Earth, which is that we do not want to be your enemies, and we do not want to conquer you, and we do not want to destroy galactic civilization. He paused and looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of as many representatives as he could. "What we want," continued Hugh, "is for you to take us seriously," and his voice carried absolute conviction, "because we have learned from bitter experience that being underestimated leads to conflict, and we would prefer to establish clear boundaries and mutual respect now, rather than wait for misunderstandings to spiral into war." Commander Thalvex had managed to establish a communication link to the command booth, where his staff were still locked out of critical systems, and he listened as Hugh continued to explain humanity's actual position, which was more nuanced and less threatening than the demonstration had suggested, but no less firm in its core demands. "Everything we have done here will be reversed," said Hayek, "and Captain Jiwoo will return full control of station systems to Commander Thalvex within the next few minutes." And sure enough, the displays began showing security protocols being restored, and Engineer Bora will provide a complete report on the vulnerabilities we exploited so that you can patch them. The fact that the humans were voluntarily giving up their advantage made the demonstration somehow more frightening rather than less, because it showed a level of confidence that suggested they could regain access anytime they chose, and several representatives were beginning to understand that humanity was offering a choice between cooperation and a conflict that would be unlike anything galactic civilization had experienced before. "We could have caused catastrophic damage," said Hayek softly. "But we chose not to because humans understand that the goal of conflict is not destruction, but rather resolution." And he looked up at the command booth, where Thalvex was watching. "And we believe that it is possible to find a resolution that benefits everyone if we approach this as equals, rather than as subordinates seeking permission from superiors." Security Chief Rentok had stopped his advance toward the platform because his warrior instincts were telling him that attacking this human would accomplish nothing except to validate every point that Hyuk had made about humanity's nature, and instead he stood with his 4 arms crossed over his armored chest while he tried to calculate how his species would fight an enemy that turned everything into a weapon. "Your sensors said no threat detected," said Hayek in conclusion, "and they were not wrong by their own parameters because we carried no weapons and we posed no immediate danger." And he gestured to himself and Mireille and the images of Captain Jiwoo and Engineer Bora, "but they were measuring the wrong things because the threat was never in what we carried but rather in what we are." He looked around the chamber one final time before stepping back from the platform. "Humanity requests recognition of our territorial claims," said Hayek formally, "and we offer in exchange our cooperation and our knowledge and our perspective on security matters." And his smile was slight but genuine. "Because we are very good at identifying vulnerabilities and we would prefer to help you fix them rather than exploit them." The emergency session of the Galactic Assembly convened within hours of Ambassador Hayek's demonstration, and representatives from 300 species gathered in physical and holographic form, to debate what they were already calling the human question, though some were calling it the human problem, and others were simply calling it the beginning of a new and uncertain era in galactic politics, where the old assumptions about power and security had been shattered by a species that nobody had considered worth noticing until it was already too late to ignore them. Trade Minister Voxler stood before the assembled delegates with his crystalline structure, shifting through colors that suggested deep concern mixed with calculation, as he presented his analysis of what humanity's infiltration of the monitoring station meant for galactic civilization. "We must understand," said Voxlar, "that this was not simply a demonstration of technical capability, but rather a revelation of fundamental psychological differences," and his structure gleamed as light refracted through it. "Because humans do not think about conflict in the same way that any known species thinks about conflict, and they do not calculate risk using the same parameters that govern our decision-making." Security Chief Rentok presented a military assessment that was grimmer than anyone expected coming from a warrior species that prided itself on tactical superiority, and his report detailed the ways that human psychological warfare and asymmetric tactics could undermine conventional military advantages. And he concluded with the uncomfortable observation that weapons designed to fight other weapons were useless against enemies who treated everything as a potential weapon, including time itself, and the patience to wait decades or centuries for opportunities. "Some of you are considering preemptive military action," said Rentok bluntly, "and I am here to tell you that such action would be catastrophic." And he displayed tactical simulations, because even if we could locate and destroy every human vessel, which we probably cannot because they have demonstrated stealth capabilities that exceed our detection systems, and even if we could eliminate their industrial capacity, which would require attacking their homeworld and killing billions of civilians, we would still face the problem that humans themselves are the weapon. The chamber fell silent as delegates absorbed this assessment, and several species whose entire strategic doctrine was based on overwhelming force were struggling to comprehend. An enemy that could not be overwhelmed because it would simply adapt and persist and find new ways to hurt you, no matter how many times you defeated it in conventional battle. A collective intelligence known as the Scientific Consensus Overmind requested time to present its analysis, and the chamber granted permission, and the Overmind's holographic avatar materialized as a shifting pattern of equations and data that the translation systems rendered into language. "We have analyzed human psychology and history and strategic thinking," said the Overmind, "and we have identified several key characteristics that make this species unprecedented in galactic civilization, and mathematical models appeared in the far air showing probability distributions and decision trees, and the primary finding is that humans operate according to principles of irrational escalation combined with creative problem-solving." The Overmind explained that most galactic species had evolved conflict resolution strategies based on calculating costs versus benefits and accepting subordinate status when the costs of resistance exceeded potential gains. But humans had apparently evolved in an environment where giving up meant death, so they developed psychological traits that prevented rational surrender, even when surrender would be the logical choice. Furthermore, continued the Overmind, humans demonstrate a capacity for what they call spite, which is the willingness to harm themselves in order to harm their enemies. And the mathematical models shifted to show game theory scenarios, and this fundamentally breaks most of our predictive models because we cannot accurately forecast the behavior of beings who will sometimes choose mutually destructive outcomes over compromises that would benefit everyone. Ambassador Hayek had been given observer status at the emergency session, and he sat quietly in a designated area while the galaxy debated his species' fate, and Dr. Mireille monitored communications traffic to assess which way the political winds were blowing, and neither of them showed any outward concern, though both understood that the next few hours would determine whether humanity's gambit had succeeded or whether they had miscalculated badly. Several radical factions proposed immediate military strikes against human territory, using the argument that a species this dangerous could not be allowed to continue developing its capabilities unchecked, and these proposals gained traction among species whose survival strategies were based on eliminating potential threats before they became actual threats. But each time such proposals came to a vote, they failed, because enough delegates understood that attacking humanity would prove every point the humans had made about galactic civilization underestimating them. Commander Thalvik surprised many by speaking in defense of diplomatic engagement with humanity. And his testimony about the 3 days that Hyuk and his team had spent infiltrating the station carried weight because Thalvik was known as a competent and cautious officer who would not exaggerate threats. "They gave back control of our systems," said Thalvik, "when they could have kept it or caused massive damage or held us hostage," and his scales rippled in patterns that suggested reluctant respect, and they provided detailed reports on every vulnerability they exploited so that we could fix them. And he looked directly at several of the delegates who were advocating violence. And that shows strategic thinking that goes beyond simple aggression, because they demonstrated power while simultaneously offering cooperation. The debate continued for hours as different factions argued for different approaches ranging from complete isolation of humanity to immediate integration to gradual observation to various forms of containment. And through it all, Hyuk sat and watched and listened, and occasionally made notes on his tablet that were actually communications with superiors back on Earth who were advising him on negotiating positions. Eventually, a new voice entered the debate, and this voice carried authority that silenced the chamber because it belonged to Premier Dabin, who was the highest-ranking human official, and she had traveled to the assembly station specifically to participate in this session, and her presence indicated that humanity was taking this moment very seriously. "Members of the Galactic Assembly," said Premier Dabin in a voice that was older and wearier than Hyuk's but no less firm, "I have come to offer you a choice." And she stood at the central platform, where Hyuk had stood days before. "Because I believe in giving people choices even when I hold advantages." She explained that humanity understood the fear that their demonstration had created, and she acknowledged that from the galactic perspective, humans represented an unprecedented challenge to the existing order. But she also pointed out that every species in the galaxy had once been unknown and potentially threatening, and the Assembly had managed to integrate thousands of different civilizations through diplomacy rather than violence. "We are offering you our knowledge of security vulnerabilities and our expertise in identifying threats that conventional systems miss," said Dabin. "And in exchange we ask only for recognition of our sovereignty over our home system and immediate surrounding space." And she displayed the same territorial map that Hyuk had shown, which represents less than 0.001% of claimed galactic territory. The mathematics of the offer were compelling because humanity was asking for very little while offering capabilities that could enhance security for everyone, and Trade Minister Voxlar performed rapid calculations in his crystalline matrix and realized that accepting humans as partners would be far more profitable than trying to subordinate or eliminate them. "But I want to be absolutely clear," continued Dabin, "about what will happen if this offer is rejected." And her tone hardened, "Because humans have studied your civilization carefully, and we understand that many species survived by accepting protection from stronger neighbors, and we will not do that." She did not threaten military action or economic warfare or any conventional form of retaliation, but instead she simply explained that if the Assembly rejected humanity's petition, then humans would demonstrate exactly how much damage a creative and persistent species could do when it decided that cooperation was impossible. "We will not attack your military forces," said Dabin, "and we will not destroy your infrastructure." And she paused. "But we will make it impossible for you to ignore us, and we will ensure that every species in the galaxy understands that humans can strike anywhere and any time, despite all your sensors and security, and we will turn your own technological superiority into a liability." The threat was subtle but effective because it suggested a kind of permanent asymmetric conflict that would drain resources and create paranoia and undermine the stability that galactic civilization depended on. And several delegates realized that humanity was essentially offering The transport ship shook as it entered the atmosphere, and Taewan gripped his seat harder than he meant to, while the alien soldiers around him sat relaxed, like this was nothing special at all. And maybe for them, it was not because they had done this 100 times before. But for him, this was his first real deployment after 3 months of basic training on Earth, where the instructors had made it very clear that humans were the newest and weakest members of the Galactic Coalition, and that he should feel lucky to even be here at all because most species thought bringing humans into the war was a waste of resources, and he tried not to think about that as the ship landed with a heavy thud on the surface of Ashfall Prime. The cargo door opened and Taiwan grabbed his gear and followed the other soldiers out into a landscape that looked like hell itself, with black soil and red sky and structures that were half melted from plasma fire, and in the distance he could see the massive walls of forward operating base Kepler rising up like a fortress, and he felt very small suddenly because this was real now and there was no going back to his little apartment in Seoul or his mother's cooking or any of the normal things he used to care about before he signed up to fight aliens he had never even heard of, until Earth joined this war 5 years ago. A Krellian officer with 4 arms and skin like blue stone stood waiting at the landing pad, and his eyes moved over the new arrivals with the kind of look that said he was not impressed at all, and when those eyes landed on Taiwan they seemed to linger with something that might have been disappointment or maybe just boredom, and the officer spoke in the common trade language that all coalition species used, and his voice sounded like rocks grinding together when he said that his name was Captain Voss, and that the new soldiers would be assigned to their squads immediately, and that there would be no time for adjustment or complaints, because the Devourers did not care if you were ready or not. Taiwan was assigned to Squad 7 along with 3 other humans, and a mix of aliens whose species he could not quite remember from his training materials. And one of the humans was a woman named Hana, who had short black hair and tired eyes, and scars on her hands that said she had been doing this for a while. And she looked at Taiwan the way someone looks at a puppy that wandered into traffic when she said welcome to the worst job in the galaxy, kid, and that humans always got the most dangerous positions because the other species figured that losing a human was not as bad as losing one of their own, since humans were so new and weak and replaceable. The barracks were cramped and smelled like metal and something else he could not identify, and Hana showed him where to put his gear and told him the basic rules like, do not touch the blue containers because they were filled with food that would kill humans, and do not argue with the Krellians because they took insults very seriously. And definitely do not go near the drone bay without permission, because that was where Unit 7 was kept, and nobody wanted to disturb a killing machine that had been operating for 1,000 years. Taiwan asked what Unit 7 was, and Hana laughed. But it was not a happy sound when she explained that it was an autonomous combat drone from some dead civilization that the Coalition had found in ancient ruins and reactivated, and that it had the longest perfect combat record in known history, with over 10,000 confirmed kills and 0 misses ever, and that it was assigned to their battalion because Command figured that having an unkillable machine on their side might make up for having so many weak humans in the unit. That night, Taiwan could not sleep because the sounds of distant explosions kept rolling across the base like thunder, and he lay on his bunk thinking about his mother and father and his little sister, who had cried when he left, and wondering if he would ever see them again. And then the alarm sirens started screaming and red lights flooded the barracks and everyone was moving and grabbing weapons, and Hana was yelling at him to get his armor on because the Devourers were testing the perimeter. Again, and this was his first real fight. The perimeter was a wall of reinforced concrete and energy shields and automated turrets, and Taiwan ran to his position, with his rifle feeling too heavy in his hands, and his heart beating so fast he thought it might explode, and then he saw them, coming across the black soil like a wave of teeth and claws and too many legs, and the Devourers looked like nightmares, made real with bodies that were part insect and part something worse, and they moved fast and low to the ground, and there were so many of them. The turrets opened fire first with streams of plasma that turned the night into day, and cut through the Devourer ranks like they were nothing, but more kept coming. And then the soldiers started firing and Taiwan pulled his trigger and watched. His shots go wild because his hands were shaking, and beside him a Krellian soldier made a disgusted sound and said something about useless humans, and Taiwan felt his face burn with shame, but he kept firing anyway, because what else could he do? Then something moved on top of the wall and Taiwan looked up and saw it for the first time. And Unit 7 was about 3 meters tall and shaped like a human, but wrong somehow, with limbs that were too long and a head that was just a smooth dome, covered in sensors, and its body was made of some dark metal that seemed to drink in the light, and it moved with a grace that did not match its size when it stepped to the edge of the wall and raised its arm, and the weapon built into that arm hummed with power. What happened next would stay in Taiwan's memory forever, because Unit 7 fired and a Devourer died, and then it fired again, and another died, and then again, and again. And every single shot was perfect, and every single target fell. And there was no wasted movement or hesitation, and it was like watching death itself work with absolute precision, and the drone moved along the wall firing and killing and never missing. And within 2 minutes the entire Devourer assault force was dead, and the silence that followed was somehow louder than the battle had been. Taewon stared at the machine as it lowered its weapon and stood perfectly still like a statue, and he understood now why the other species were not afraid, and why having Unit 7 in their battalion meant something, and he also understood that he was looking at something that was more dangerous than anything he had ever imagined. And the thought that this thing was on his side should have been comforting, but instead, it made him feel even smaller than before, because what use was a human soldier when you had a perfect killing machine that never missed? 3 days after the perimeter attack, Captain Voss called the entire battalion together in the main briefing hall, and the room was packed with soldiers from a dozen different species, and Taewon stood near the back with Hana and the other humans from Squad 7 and tried to make himself small, because he still felt the shame of how badly he had performed during his first real fight, and some of the alien soldiers had made sure he knew they noticed. Captain Voss stood on the platform with his forearms crossed and his blue stone face showing no emotion when he activated the holographic display, and a 3-dimensional map appeared in the air, showing a section of terrain about 50 kilometers from the base, and he explained that Coalition intelligence had located a Devourer breeding facility deep underground, and that the facility was producing thousands of new warriors every week, and that if they did not destroy it soon, the enemy would have enough forces to overrun not just this base but 3 others in the sector. The mission plan was simple in the way that military plans are always simple, which means it sounded easy, but would probably be terrible in practice. And the idea was that they would insert through a collapsed tunnel system and fight their way down to the central breeding chamber and plant enough explosives to bring the whole facility down on itself. And Captain Voss said that Unit 7 would lead the assault, because the tunnels would be too narrow and dangerous for a full battalion, but perfect for a small strike team backed by a combat drone that never missed. Squad 7 was chosen to support the mission, and Taewon felt his stomach drop when he heard that, because supporting Unit 7 meant following right behind it into the worst fighting, and Hana leaned close and whispered that this was typical, because humans always got the jobs that other species did not want, and he wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. They deployed before dawn in a transport that flew low and fast over the black terrain, and Taewon checked his weapon for the 10th time and tried not to think about what was waiting for them underground, and across from him sat a Vrex soldier, with scales like red metal and eyes like yellow coins, and the Vrex watched him with the kind of look that predators give to prey, and finally said that it had taken bets with the other aliens on how long the humans would last, and that Taewon should try not to die in the first 10 minutes because that would cost it money. The tunnel entrance was a dark hole in the side of a cliff, and the transport dropped them on a narrow ledge and immediately took off again because staying in one place too long was asking to be shot down, and Captain Voss organized the squad into formation with Unit 7 at the front and the humans in the middle, and the more experienced alien soldiers at the back. And Taewon understood that this meant the humans were not trusted to guard the rear, and were instead being kept where the veterans could watch them. Unit 7 moved into the tunnel first, and its sensors glowed with soft blue light in the darkness, and the squad followed, and immediately the walls closed in around them, and the air became thick and hot, and smelled like rot and chemicals, and Taewon had to fight down the panic that came from being underground in the dark with things that wanted to kill him. They walked for 20 minutes before they encountered the first Devourer patrol, and Taewon did not even see them until Unit 7 stopped and raised its weapon and fired 3 times in less than a second, and 3 Devourers fell dead with perfect shots through their brain clusters, and the drone kept moving forward like nothing had happened, and the squad had to hurry to keep up. The fighting got worse as they went deeper, and the Devourers came in larger groups and from multiple directions, but Unit 7 killed them all with the same perfect precision, and Taewon started to notice something strange about the way the drone fought, because sometimes it would pause for just a fraction of a second before taking a shot, and at first he thought maybe its targeting system was lagging, but then he realized that the pauses always happened when a human was in or near the line of fire, and the drone would wait until the human moved to a safer position before it pulled the trigger. He mentioned this to Hana during a brief rest period, and she looked at him like he was crazy. and said that combat drones did not care about collateral damage, and that he was probably just imagining things because he was scared. But Taiwan was. Sure, he was right because he had been watching Unit 7 carefully, and the pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. They reached the main chamber after 4 hours of fighting, and descended a long ramp that spiraled down into a massive cavern that was so huge, Taiwan could not see the far wall, and the entire space was filled with organic structures that pulsed and writhed and made sounds like breathing, and in the center of it all was something that made his brain hurt to look at, because it was too big and too wrong. And Captain Voss said in a quiet voice that this was the Nest Queen and that she was responsible for breeding all the devourers in this facility. Unit 7 stopped at the bottom of the ramp and stood perfectly still for 10 seconds, and then 20, and then 30. And its sensors were locked on the Nest Queen and running calculations. And finally Captain Voss asked what the delay was, and the drone spoke for the first time in a voice that sounded like metal scraping on metal, when it said that it had a clear shot on the primary target, but that there were complications. The complication was that the entire chamber was filled with thousands of devourer warriors in some kind of dormant state, and they were attached to the walls and ceiling and floor like cocoons, and Unit 7 calculated that any weapon discharge strong enough to kill the Nest Queen would also wake up every single warrior in the chamber, and that the squad would be overrun in approximately 45 seconds after that. And Captain Voss said that this was acceptable and ordered the drone to take the shot anyway because completing the mission was more important than the survival of one squad. Unit 7 did not move, and Captain Voss repeated the order with more force in his voice, and still the drone did not move. And Taiwan felt something cold run down his spine because he had never heard of a combat drone refusing an order. And the other soldiers were looking at each other with confusion and maybe a little fear, because machines were supposed to obey always and without question. Captain Voss demanded an explanation, and Unit 7 turned its smooth head to look at the squad, and spoke again in that terrible metal voice when it said that success probability for eliminating the primary target was 99.7%, but that squad survival probability after target elimination was 0.0%, and that this represented unacceptable risk to Allied units, and therefore it was declining to take the shot. The chamber went silent except for the breathing sounds of the organic structures, and Taiwan realized that he was watching something impossible happen because Unit 7 had maintained a perfect combat record for 1,000 years and had never refused an order and had never failed to eliminate a target. And yet here it stood refusing to fire because doing so would kill the soldiers it was supposed to protect. Captain Voss said that the drone was malfunctioning and that he was overriding its protocols and ordering it to fire immediately. And Unit 7 said that it was not malfunctioning and that its primary directive was to eliminate enemy targets while minimizing Allied casualties, and that taking a shot that would certainly result in total squad death violated that directive, and that it would not comply. The Krellian captain looked like he wanted to tear the drone apart with his forearms, but instead he activated his communicator and reported the situation to command and waited for orders. And while they waited, Taiwan stared at Unit 7 and thought about what Hana had said about the drone not caring about collateral damage, and realized that she had been wrong because Unit 7 cared very much about keeping them alive. And maybe it had always cared, and maybe that was why it had never missed in 1,000 years, because missing was not just about failing to hit a target, but about hitting your own people instead. Command took 15 minutes to respond, and when they did, Captain Voss listened to whatever they said with his face getting harder and colder, and when he closed the communication channel, he looked at the squad with something that might have been regret or might have been nothing at all, and he said that the mission was too important to abort, and that Command had authorized him to detonate the explosives manually, which meant that someone would have to stay behind to trigger them after. Unit 7 killed the Nest Queen, and everyone knew what that meant. The alien soldiers nodded like this made perfect sense because in war, sometimes you had to sacrifice pieces to win the game, and the Vrek soldier who had made bets about Taiwan dying said that it was a shame about the explosives cost, but at least the mission would succeed, and Taiwan felt something hot and angry rise in his chest because these soldiers were talking about dying like it was just another item on a checklist. Hana stepped forward and her voice was tight when she said that this was insane, and that there had to be another way. And Captain Voss said that there was not, and that the humans had volunteered for coalition service knowing the risks, and that sometimes those risks meant not going home, and Hana looked like she wanted to shoot him, but she just stood there shaking with anger. And Taiwan knew that she had seen too many humans die already in this war. Captain Voss ordered Unit 7 to prepare to fire, and said that he would stay behind to trigger the explosives himself, since he was the ranking officer, and the drone moved its weapon into position, but still did not fire, and the Krellian captain said that he was giving a direct order, and Unit 7 said in that metal voice that it understood the order, but that it had calculated that detonating the explosives would kill whoever stayed behind before they could escape, and that this still violated its directive about minimizing Allied casualties. The standoff continued with Captain Voss getting angrier, and Unit 7 standing motionless and the rest of the squad watching with the kind of tension that comes right before everything breaks apart, and Taiwan realized that nobody was thinking about solutions because they were all too busy arguing about protocols and orders and acceptable losses, and he thought about his training and how the instructors had always said that humans were weak but adaptable, and that sometimes adaptation was more important than strength. He walked forward before he could talk himself out of it, and everyone turned to look at him like they had forgotten he was there, and he stopped next to Unit 7 and looked up at the smooth dome that served as its head, and he asked if the drone would take the shot if someone could improve the odds, and there was silence for a moment, and then Unit 7 turned to face him, and its sensors swept over him, and Taiwan felt like he was being examined by something ancient and powerful and very careful. Unit 7 asked what improvement he proposed, and Taiwan explained his idea, which was probably stupid, but it was better than standing around waiting to die. And the core concept was that they could use the squad's remaining equipment to create a distraction that would move the Nest Queen away from the dormant warriors and into a position where Unit 7 could kill her without waking up the entire chamber. And then they could plant the explosives and leave before anything went wrong. Captain Voss said that this was ridiculous, and that a human recruit with 3 days of field experience could not possibly have a better plan than trained officers and command staff. But Unit 7 asked Taiwan to explain the details, and so he did, while using his hands to sketch out positions in the air and talking fast because he was afraid that if he slowed down he would realize how crazy this was and stop. The plan required using their sonic emitters, which were normally used for communication and navigation, to create a harmonic frequency that would irritate the Nest Queen enough to make her move, and if they placed the emitters in the right pattern, they could guide her like herding an animal into the exact position where Unit 7 would have a clean shot, with zero risk of hitting anything else. And then while she was distracted, they could plant the explosives on the organic structures that supported the chamber and be gone before she knew what happened. Unit 7 was quiet for a long moment, and Taiwan could almost feel the drone's processors working through millions of calculations and probability matrices, and then it said that the plan had a 73% chance of success, which was not perfect but was significantly better than 0%, and that it was willing to attempt this approach if the human could execute his part correctly. Captain Voss looked like he wanted to argue, but one of the other alien soldiers pointed out that 73% was better odds than they usually got in this war, and that letting the human try was better than definitely dying, and slowly. The rest of the squad nodded agreement, and the Krellian captain finally said that they would try it, but that if Taiwan failed, then they would go back to the original plan. Hana grabbed Taiwan's arm and asked if he was sure about this, and he said no, but that he was going to do it anyway. And she looked at him for a moment and then said that she would help, because she was not going to let him die alone doing something stupid, and he felt grateful and terrified in equal measure. They spent 20 minutes preparing, and Taiwan showed Hana where to place the sonic emitters and explained the frequency pattern they needed to create, and she listened carefully and asked smart questions, and he was glad she was there because he was still shaking from fear, and having someone else who believed in the plan made it feel less insane. The chamber walls were rough and organic, and climbing them was like climbing the inside of something's throat. But Taiwan had grown up climbing buildings in Seoul for fun, and Hana moved like someone who had done harder things than this, and they placed the emitters at precise points while the rest of the squad watched from below, and Unit 7 stood perfectly still calculating firing solutions. When all the emitters were in place, Taiwan climbed back down, and his hands were bleeding from gripping the rough walls, and his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, and he looked at Unit 7 and asked if it was ready, and the drone said that it was, and that the human should proceed when ready. Taiwan activated the emitters, and immediately the chamber filled with a sound that was too low to hear properly, but that he could feel in his bones, and the Nest Queen responded exactly as he had hoped by stirring and moving, and her massive body shifted away from the dormant warriors and toward the source of the irritation, and Unit 7 tracked her movement with its weapon and waited for the perfect moment. But then one of the emitters failed and the frequency pattern broke, and the Nest Queen moved in the wrong direction, and Taewon realized with cold horror that she was going to wake up the warriors if she kept moving that way. And he did the only thing he could think of, which was to run out into the open and wave his arms and yell, and make himself the target instead of the emitters. The Nest Queen's attention shifted to him immediately, and she moved fast for something so large, and Taewon ran, leading her across the chamber floor toward where Unit 7 needed her to be. And behind him he could hear Hana screaming his name and Captain Voss shouting orders, but he did not stop because stopping meant dying, and he kept running even though his lungs burned and his legs felt like they would give out. He was almost to the right position when his foot caught on something and he fell hard, and the Nest Queen was right behind him, and he could smell her breath, which was like rot and acid, and he rolled over to see her massive form looming above him and knew that he had run out of time and that this was how it ended. Then Unit 7 moved faster than anything that size should be able to move, and the drone was between him and the Nest Queen, and its weapon came up and fired, and the shot took the Nest Queen in exactly the right spot, and she fell like a mountain, collapsing, and the sound was so loud that Taewon's ears stopped working for a moment, and when they started again there was silence, except for his own breathing. Unit 7 stood over him and its sensors swept the chamber checking for threats, and then the drone looked down at him and extended one metal hand and pulled him to his feet and held him steady until his legs stopped shaking, and in a voice that seemed different, somehow quieter maybe, or more careful, it said that the asset was secured and the mission could proceed.